Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor John V. Kofus has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a topic on inter-imperialist rivalries in the 21st century. The United States, especially in the last 20 years, but more important, in the last 10 years, from the first Trump administration to Biden to the second Trump administration, has pursued a rather aggressive policy of imperialist expansion. One way is through the resolve to expand NATO beyond the North Atlantic region and into the entire world. In other words, setting no limits on NATO. The question is, what would be the purpose of NATO expansion in the rest of the world, considering NATO was founded during the Truman administration, United States, of course, being the chief sponsor, major contributor, the most important contributor to the organization, to the defensive alliance. It was to be a counterweight to the Soviet bloc, and it has been used since the end of the Soviet bloc as leverage for global expansion of the G7, especially with the United States leading it, and global market share, securing global market share. Now, there are, on the issue of imperialism and inter-imperialist rivalries, I should tell you there are more than 20,000 books on this topic, and many more than that, articles, scholarly articles, as well as newspaper, magazine articles. So this is a very important topic, a very complex topic, and one that has especially come into focus in the public debate throughout the world, not just in one country, during the second Trump administration, largely because the President of the United States, Donald Trump, did make, immediately upon taking office, some very bold statements about buying Greenland, basically making Canada the 51st state. Not that it's going to happen, but he did say that. Seizing the Panama Canal from a sovereign country, by the way. Demanding that Ukraine make major concessions to the United States in exchange for the United States providing security guarantees down the road in the future. This last one, obviously, even mainstream, that is non-leftist, neoliberal, both conservative and liberal politicians and scholars have labeled aggressive imperialism, extortion, coercion, and so forth. They've used different terms to describe. Now, the question is, what is imperialism? The word imperialism simply means that one country, obviously through the efforts of the government, is encroaching, is imposing its will militarily, economically, culturally, politically over another, with the intent of hegemony and exploitation. Imperialism is not a phenomenon of the 21st century, but rather dates back to the ancient times. It goes back to the times of ancient Persian, the Persian Empire expanding westward and attacking, for example, the Greek city-states. Athens had an imperialist policy intended, of course, to secure trade routes. The Roman Republic and the Roman Empire were based on an imperialist and expansionist policy throughout the Mediterranean world, from the British Isles to Persia, to Iran, in other words. So they were imperialist as well. In the Middle Ages, the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne was imperialist. The Chinese under Mongol rule, under Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan in the 13th century were imperialist. India from the 16th to the 18th century under Mughal rule, they were imperialist. And then, of course, the Europeans, the Northwest Europeans, from the 16th century onwards to the 20th century and to the present, actually, the 21st century, remained imperialist because Northwest Europe basically colonized much of what we call the global South. They partitioned Africa by the late 19th century. Completely, the continent belonged in European hands. They had colonized the Western Hemisphere. They went into Asia. So colonization, of course, which is the ultimate form of imperialism, was part of the European policy. In the late 19th century, the United States and Japan also joined the imperialist race, the race for global market share. The question is, why is imperialism so bad? Why is it so wrong? Imperialism is not just a matter of violating the sovereignty of a nation state. Imperialism is really, the ultimate goal of imperialism is to exploit the labor and resources of another country. Imperialism has been identified with, in the last 500 years, with a capitalist political economy. It is an integral part of capitalism. You can't separate imperialism from capitalism. And it manifested itself in very blatant terms in the late 19th century, especially with the British Empire. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli was called the imperialist prime minister, for example, in England. And imperialism evolved into inter-imperialist rivalries from the 19th century onwards, even before that, but let's start in the late 19th century for our purposes today, and we'll see how inter-imperialist rivalries have molded the world balance of power and how that has destabilized politically, socially, and economically the entire world in our time. The British and the Germans were imperialist rivalries in the late 19th century, and this led to World War I. So one of the major risks in inter-imperialist rivalries, that is, imperialist powers going head-to-head with each other, because the world has been divided into zones of influence, commercial zones of influence, and there is a race for market share on behalf of the state pursuing imperialist policies, on behalf of the private sector to enrich companies, not the working class, by the way. Certainly, the working class is not the beneficiary, although, let me just parenthetically point out that Western imperialism did contribute to the strengthening of the industrial base of Northwest Europe, the United States, and of course in late 19th century Japan as well. And that did result in upward social mobility, that is the formation of a greater middle class. So imperialism did result in an expanding middle class and strengthened the core countries of the capitalist world economy. So the fact is that imperialism is to the advantage of the imperialist powers, and there are derivative benefits that filter down, but not necessarily in all cases, and not necessarily at no risk, considering that wars of imperialism, for example, in the late 19th century, from 1870 to 1914, cumulatively led to the Great War, as it was called, that is World War I. In 1902, the great English scholar John Hobson, a liberal, by the way, not a Marxist, because let me just point out, by the way, point blank, that imperialism is a topic that Karl Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, Vladimir Lenin, leftists have been, that is, Marxists have been interested in since Karl Marx, Das Kapital, the capital in English. So this is a topic of the left. Hobson, an English scholar, publishing a book entitled Imperialism, actually influenced Marxists, including Vladimir Lenin, by the way. Hobson wrote this book at the end of the Boer War. Boers were the Dutch farmers down in the Transvaal region in South Africa, where the diamond mines down there. And there was a war in South Africa, and behind this war, it was sort of a proxy war. Okay, behind this war, behind the Dutch farmers, were actually the German government, which was competing with England, with Great Britain. It was competing with Great Britain. Great Britain was the other party in this conflict. And John Hobson wrote this book warning that wars of imperialism, like the one in South Africa at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, could lead to a global conflict. And that's exactly what happened 12 years after John Hobson published this book. And this is an important lesson, because we are now living in the age of inter-imperialist rivalries, namely the United States and the lesser G7 on one side, that is its junior partners in the G7 on one side, although under Trump's America First policy, under the tariff wars policy, there is fragmentation even within the G7, considering, as Warren Buffett, the American billionaire, pointed out just recently, imposing tariffs is a form of warfare. Okay? So that is not, that bloc, that US-led G7 bloc is not as solid as it appears on the surface. The inter-imperialist rivalry is not just between the United States, in other words, and China, which is its major economic rival, and Russia, with most of the nuclear warheads on the planet. It's also within the G7, and it's also within the allies of the G7. So that is an important thing to consider. Now, the media, the mass media, mainstream media, presents inter-imperialist rivalries and imperialism as something that has to do with the nation state, when in fact the genesis of imperialism and the roots of imperialism are in the capitalist system. The beneficiaries of imperialism, the reason that each state pursues imperialism, okay, is to benefit private companies seeking market share. So when Trump imposes tariffs and has the American first label as preeminent in his populist right-wing rhetoric, he is in fact promoting tangible interests. And when you scratch the surface and look at who is behind public policy, the tariff policy, there are Wall Street interests. This does not mean that everyone in the capitalist class supports it. Like I said, Warren Buffett considered it a form of warfare. He's against it. So there are capitalists, however, who are in fact behind the policy of imperialism, whether it's in Germany or in Japan or in the United States or in China or in Russia. And we'll look at how Russia and China, by the way, are involved in this as well. But let me stick with the United States and this issue of who benefits from imperialism. The beneficiaries of imperialism are not the workers in the country imposing imperialism, and certainly in the country that is suffering from imperialist intrusion, whether it's the tariff wars or whether it's military intervention or whether it's any form of destabilization, sanctions, for example, and so forth. So the regime change and all of that. So the imperialist policy is intended to benefit geopolitically the country imposing it, and for geoeconomic reasons, that is, for specific tangible reasons, for specific companies. For example, the obvious one in the United States in pursuing a proxy war in Ukraine is the military-industrial complex. That's the obvious one. But it's not just that. It's other companies looking ahead after the war is over to secure reconstruction contracts, as we found out from the declassified information that the Telegraph newspaper in England published when Trump demanded that contracts basically flow mostly to the United States, especially when there was a demand that the minerals, that half the receipts of the mineral wealth of Ukraine, estimated at 15 trillion, by the way, that's just an estimate, and we'll talk more about that, accrue to the United States in exchange for protection. It's like protection money. In any case, the fact is that this should not sound as alarming as the mainstream media has made it out to be, because many countries procuring major weapons from suppliers, whether, for example, it's France, countries buying aircraft for their defense from France. France then it's implied that it's obligated to also support that country diplomatically. So a country procuring weapons, so in this exchange of I'll buy weapons, you got to buy I'm also buying some protection from you, diplomatic protection from you. There's this implied relationship. So imperialism is in fact in the last analysis, an integral part of the capitalist system. One of the reasons that Vladimir Lenin, influenced by John Hobson, as well as Rosa Luxemburg, the brilliant analyst of imperialism in the late 19th, early 20th century, wrote the book. Vladimir Lenin wrote the book in 1916, "Imperialism: The Highest Stage of Capitalism," arguing that the world found itself in a global conflict in August 1914 because of the competition among businesses from different parts of Europe struggling for market share. And the price was paid, of course, by the people, by civilians subjected to war. And and the reason I'm mentioning this is because here we are in the 21st century, already two regional conflicts, very serious, both Ukraine and Israel. And the prospect of a global war was mentioned repeatedly throughout the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. And Moscow, basically, with its back on the wall, threatening to go nuclear, which of course is would be a complete disaster if it found that its very survival was at stake. Now, the question is whether there are scholars who argue there are also, besides the core countries who have the tools of imperialism. I used to work with a colleague who had written a book by that title, Tools of Imperialism. Whether the countries that are in the core of the capitalist world economy, like the United States, for example, and the G7, as well as China, Russia, although Russia is hardly in the core, but China is, whether it is just those countries that have the ability to be imperialists and countries with enormous firepower, with enormous defense arsenal, like Russia, which has the world's most nuclear warheads, more than the United States. And some scholars, and I agree with them, maintain that there is such a thing as sub-imperialist states. And we have them today. Those are in the semi-periphery sector. We have them today, and I can just name a few of them: India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel. These are all imperialists at the regional level and pursue imperialism at the regional level and pursue hegemony at the regional level, trying to determine the balance of power at the regional level, just like the great powers, okay? Just like China is trying to do it in the United States and Russia on the world scale, on a world scale, on a global level, at the global level, the semi-periphery countries are trying to do it at the regional level. Israel wants to be the dominant strategic and geoeconomic power, focusing on energy as an energy distributor in the Middle East, distributor, not producer. Turkey wants that role for itself. One of the reasons for the clash between Turkey and Israel is exactly that. So these are examples of sub-imperialist states. On whose behalf are they doing this? The workers of Israel? The workers of Turkey? No. Companies. They are the ones that benefit. India, the same thing under Modi. Okay? Modi is a neoliberal. Benjamin Netanyahu is a neoliberal. Turkey's Erdogan is a neoliberal. All these neoliberals, by the way, let me just briefly explain neoliberalism. It starts in the late 70s in Chile. The US sets the foundation for it under Jimmy Carter. And then it's institutionalized in the 80s, US, UK, and it spreads globally. Neoliberalism is the political economy model under which the world economy operates today. Obviously, a lot of people associate it with globalization, but it's not just that. Neoliberalism means deregulation of the economy so that the private sector, that capitalism moves increasingly toward monopoly, the monopoly phase, like we had the oligopolies of the late 19th century, the era of monopoly capitalism, early 20th century. It means privatization of public assets so that the private companies benefit from securing contracts as well as bailouts when they're in crisis, like banks, for example, or other insurance companies, other companies like that. We had the situation with the Great Recession of 2008. Corporate subsidies, corporate welfare is the trademark of neoliberalism. The reality is that neoliberalism is all about transferring assets from the social welfare state to the corporate welfare state, which we're in today. Trump, in his second term, is going full speed ahead with corporate welfare. His number one campaign contributor, who has been appointed to the Department of Government Efficiency, Doggy, as I like to call it, Doge, I guess they pronounce it Doge. But that group, the Musk group, targeting the reorganization of federal bureaucracies, with the ultimate goal, by the way, of handing hundreds of billions in contracts, not necessarily his own company, although there have been reports about that, but to Silicon Valley, to mechanize through artificial intelligence purchases from Silicon Valley the federal bureaucracy and make it more capital intensive and less labor intensive, and presumably save the taxpayer. This is part of a strategy to hand over money from the taxpayer to corporations, and at the expense of the working class. Okay, and an extension of that is the United States putting sanctions, tariffs on companies competing with Silicon Valley, as we know. And this is a bipartisan policy, by the way. It has nothing to do with Trump. Both Democrats and Republicans have been doing this. They support this. So for whose benefit is all of this? For whose benefit is economic imperialism that Trump and Biden pursued, on top of another dimension? And this is what I want to come to next, and that is what Russia and China have been complaining about, and that is hegemony. The United States in 1990, under George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush, who succeeded Ronald Reagan, he was vice president under Ronald Reagan, announced the end of the Soviet bloc, the end of the Cold War, and a new world order under U.S. hegemony. Unipolar world order. The end of history. Nonsense, in other words. The end of history meant that the unipolar world order transcends time. It's above time. It's natural. It's part of nature. Well, the fact is that the unipolar world order was aimed to not end imperialism, which had continued throughout the 20th century, from the 19th century, in more subtle terms through the Bretton Woods system, using the IMF and the World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, by the way, and using the pretext of we have to be on guard because the other side is communist, throughout the Cold War. So let's build capitalism synonymously and wrongly linked to democracy. Capitalism has nothing to do with democracy. Capitalism is anti-democratic. Capitalism by nature, by its very structure, means hierarchy. It does not mean egalitarianism. It does not mean that society, that the social contract in society is designed to benefit everyone across the board. It means a hierarchical structure. And one of the reasons that just recently there was a report that's rather alarming pointed out that I think there are 24 people in the world that own 60%, 16% of the world's GDP, the size of France's GDP, by the way. That's capitalism. That is capitalism. In the absence of neoliberal policies, invariably linked to imperialism, by the way, with a military dimension that the United States is pursuing, or without a military dimension that China is pursuing. China and Russia is imperialist, has been from the Romanov period to Putin, by the way, throughout the Soviet period, especially under Stalin, relying heavily on its defense sector. Now, in defense of Russia, if you study its history, and I used to teach Russian history, if you study its history, it has pursued from Ivan the Terrible to the Soviet period internal colonialism. Now, Vladimir Lenin did not believe. He was adamantly against colonialism, adamantly against imperialism. He wrote against imperialism when World War I broke out and so forth. Stalin did not share that view. Stalin fashioned himself as something like a Ivan the Terrible Tsar. So he deviated sharply. But Russia, with its internal colonialism, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because of the conflict in Ukraine, has always regarded that the regions around it are to be its zones of influence, an old imperialist view, by the way, so that it feels that it's secure, that its national security is not compromised. Exactly the point that Putin has been making about Ukraine. Don't make Ukraine part of NATO and part of the European Union, because it's on our doorstep, and that threatens our security. So we have to take measures to stop that. This is not about the Soviet Union. This goes back to the Romanov era. This is part of an old internal colonialist expansion, consolidating within the Eurasian Romanov Empire, the old Russian Empire, consolidating territorially against the West, but also against the Asian powers on the other side, China and Japan on the other side. So Russia and China are also imperialist. It is, however, today, Russia and China are arguing that they are advocating in this inter-imperialist rivalry world we're living in, they're advocating a world that is not unipolar that Bush announced back in 1990, but multipolar to reflect the realities of the real power structure in the balance of power, in the world balance of power, and to reflect the fact that China-led BRICS group has a greater GDP on a world scale, obviously, than the G7, which it does. And it's constantly expanding. So what we have here are countries that are objecting to what? US unipolar imperialism, both at the geopolitical level, using defense as leverage to secure geoeconomic advantages on a world scale. That's what they're objecting to. neither China nor Russia are anti-imperialist. They're not about egalitarianism. When you examine uh, uh, the uh, the benefits accruing to the working class in both China and Russia, um, they are there, but they're minimal, especially in Russia, by the way. Now, China does have a social development policy along with its economic policy. Part of the reason is not just because China is living the legacy of the Maoist era, Mao Zedong, who was in fact the father of the Communist Revolution back in the 1940s, but because the Chinese leadership sees the advantages of expanding consumer spending to stimulate internal consumption and to replace what they lose in market share in trade from the G7, especially the United States, which imposes tariffs, and they just impose new ones. So to make it up that way, but also to develop, those of you who have studied China, you know this, to develop the Western provinces, which are the poorest ones, by the way. All the provinces all along the eastern part of China, from Beijing down to Hong Kong, Shanghai, Hong Kong, all of that is it's prosperous in comparison to the western parts, and that's where development is really needed. But there is a social development policy in China, by the way. So Chinese capitalism, which, by the way, is a mixed economy with a heavy dose of statism, that is, the state continues to do economic planning, 5-year plans, looking ahead. The state has a huge role in economic planning, a huge role in the economy, by the way, guiding global economic integration through the Belt and Road Initiative program, and pursuing the benefits accruing to Chinese companies. Yes, that's exactly what it's doing, with some derivative benefits going to the working class, first to their own people, and then providing a social development component to economic development when they go to other countries, to the Belt Initiative program. For example, if they're going to build a port in Peru, they'll also build a hospital, they'll build schools. So this is a component of that. By contrast, imperialism on the part of the G7. Let me take a very recent example, by the way. That is the United States and the UK in the Indian Ocean. In October 2024, just recently, the UK handed back sovereignty of Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean to Mauritius, which is an independent sovereign country. Used to be part of Africa, used to be colonized by the British. It used to be a colony of the British. However, the British had struck out a deal to use the Chagos Island, I think there's 60 of them, to use those islands to put military bases there. And just recently, the United States agreed with the United Kingdom. First of all, by the way, the United States, especially Republican senators, were adamantly against the United Kingdom making this deal back in October, reverting sovereignty of these islands to Mauritius, the country that the islands belong to. And they argued, why are you doing this? This is going to benefit China. China is indeed the #1 trading partner of Mauritius. Okay, China has not set up military bases there. China has military bases in 2 countries, I believe, in Djibouti and Kyrgyzstan, or one of those Central Asian countries. It does not, unlike the United States, which has military presence, not necessarily full-scale bases, in something like 175 out of 195 countries in the world, and spends 3 times more in defense. Its defense budget is 3 times higher than that of China. And yet it complains about Chinese military threat. China is not interested in using the defense sector as leverage for economic imperialism. It makes deals, like it did here in this case, with countries at the economic level and provides a component of social development. It will build some roads, it will build perhaps a health center, some schools, some parks. It will go that route. The US and the UK, the G7, invariably have a focus on defense, on military presence as leverage for securing trade deals, for leverage to stop the other side, their major rival, in this case, China, which is the world's #1 trading partner, by the way. Let's get that out of the way. And the world's largest manufacturing country. So there is, while the United States is pursuing economic and military imperialism using both economic and military means, by the way, imperialism is not confined to just those political, there's cultural imperialism and so forth. But the United States is pursuing the military angle as leverage along with sanctions and tariffs and using pressure and coercion on third countries to not to sign contracts, for example, with China. This is all part of subtle imperialism, economic imperialism. The question, of course, is why is all of this of concern to the average person? U.S. imperialism has resulted, especially from the invasion of Afghanistan after September 11, then Iraq, very costly operations, okay? Amid the war on terror, this manufactured war on terror, doesn't mean there aren't jihadists, but the question is, why has there been a rise in Islamic unconventional warfare called terrorism, of course? And why is the military solution the only route to counter this phenomenon throughout March of Africa, for example, the Middle East, obviously, the Indian subcontinent? Why is that? Other than feeding the military-industrial complex, not just of the United States, but the G7, feeding it. The inter-imperialist rivalry actually serves these corporate interests. In our present era, what we have with inter-imperialist rivalry under Trump right now is that it has expanded beyond just China. Trump, with his strategy of co-opting Russia by ending the war in Ukraine, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and ameliorating relations with Moscow and breaking it off to some degree, it's not going to be possible to a large degree, by the way, from China, okay, is following Henry Kissinger's strategy, which Henry Kissinger invented. He based it on the Austrian foreign minister of the early 19th century, Prince Clemens von Metternich, who Kissinger wrote a book about, by the way, a book entitled A World Restored at Harvard. It was his dissertation, and it was later published. I doubt if Trump has read it. I don't know. Maybe he has read it. But he has advisors who can tell him all of this. And his strategy has been to ameliorate relations with Russia, focus on China, because Trump is more of an economic imperialist than a Cold War liberal warmonger, as he accuses the neoconservatives behind both the Democratic Party and the mainstream Republicans, more or less the non-Trump Republicans. So Trump is against using the resources of the country, because he saw what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, trillions wasted, and in the end, the Taliban took back power, and the U.S. was left with what? In the case of Iraq, Iran is very influential inside Iraq. Okay, so Trump is shy about military adventures. He is not interested in the neoconservative approach to imperialism. That is the military role, military solutions, forever war doctrines, not the way he approaches it. He is more of an economic imperialist. However, this is not to say that Trump is not going to utilize his part of a system. He's not going to utilize the military. On the contrary, he is strengthening the defense sector, although he has announced that down the road, perhaps they should be looking at reducing the almost $1 trillion of the defense budget. The entire budget of the United States, by the way, is just under 7 trillion, just shy of 7 trillion. 1.2 trillion goes to pay the interest on debt. Another trillion goes for defense. So all the rest is for everything else. The entitlement programs take a good chunk out of that. That is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. He wants to chop those. So we have here an individual who is really interested in economic imperialism, and this brings us to the noise he made. And it's just not just noise. He says he's really interested in this, and the noise he made about buying Greenland, although it's not for sale. Denmark has said it, because Greenland, he said, it's for our national security. U.S. is going to protect all of you from what? China, Russia. Considering he wants to ameliorate relations with Russia, why include Russia in this? In any event, Greenland has a lot of minerals, and especially rare earth minerals. The other country he has indirectly threatened is Canada. Okay, its next door neighbor, and then Mexico. He wants to redraw the map of the border of Canada, by the way. Feels like it's unfair to the United States to. And then in Mexico, he just recently sent some troops along the border there. And he wants to seize the Panama Canal from Panama, a sovereign country, which, by the way, the U.S. created. There was no Panama before the Spanish-American War. It was a province of Colombia. The U.S. Navy and U.S. operatives went down there and instigated a rebel movement, and with it, the Navy muscle that they had, created the Panama as an independent country, and then, of course, signed a 99-year lease to get the canal. Right? They built the canal under Theodore Roosevelt. Yes. So now he wants it back. Why? Because the Chinese have increasingly influenced. Obviously, China is the world's #1 shipping power. They have the largest manufacturing capacity. They're the world's largest trading partner, not just one country, it's the world's. And they use the Panama Canal. And they just recently signed a major deal with, last fall, with Peru to build a major port So they're going to be using it even more. So Trump is looking at it as leverage against China. He wants to take it. That's naked economic imperialism. Gaza wants to take it. Do what with it? Make it the French Riviera of the southeastern Mediterranean world. Get rid of the Palestinians, sorry, and build luxury hotels and expensive real estate for the rich in Gaza without Palestinians necessarily. Well, there may be jobs for them as waiters and cooks, but that's about it. They won't be able to afford the expensive luxury real estate in Gaza. This is economic imperialism, not according to me, but according to not according to Marxist scholars. They obviously do see it that way, but mainstream media looks at it that way. The Jacques Delors Institute of France. Jacques Delors was a French politician who was a big advocate of the European Union. Recently published an article, the Institute, which is a think tank, published an article stating that American imperialism is threatening Europe's sovereignty, integrity, and economic interests. This is the Jacques Delors Institute. This is not the Vladimir Lenin Institute. This is a mainstream Western think tank. They came out with. The reason this is important, because what we have here is the open debate about how inter-imperialist rivalries are destabilizing not just relations between the United States and China, the world's two largest economies, combined, by the way, they're 43% of the world GDP. They determine the fate of the planet. 43% of the world GDP determines the fate of the planet. It's in their hands. China, because of that economic power, and by the way, I have heard arguments that China is not imperialist. No, it's not imperialist. In what sense? In the sense that Trump is an economic imperialist and that Biden was a military imperialist. Not in that sense, but by the very nature of China's economic muscle, it is in the position to determine the terms of trade. So when it goes to a country to sign a deal on a port and infrastructure projects, it is in the position as the dominant economic power in the world, by the way. In PPP terms, in purchasing power parity terms, China is the world's #1 economy, 7-8 trillion ahead of the United States. Without that huge debt that the U.S. has accumulated, about to go higher by 5 trillion, if Congress has its way of passing 4.5 trillion in tax cuts primarily for the wealthy. Okay, so China is the economic power of the world. By the nature of that, and the fact that it is pursuing policies that benefit state-owned as well as private companies, and Xi Jinping, the president of China, just met with the heads of high-tech companies, especially interested in artificial intelligence companies, to give them essentially more leeway, more powers, and also ease some of the restrictions on foreign investments. He wants more foreign investment. So economic integration is continuing. China, by the very nature of its economy, is an imperialist economic power. It is not in favor of pursuing all of this for the sake of the working class. Yes, it has a social development policy, which is much more, it's a policy that's much better, much more benevolent than a lot of countries in the world. It's not Norway, but it's very generous in comparison to the United States, which has 12% of its population below the poverty line, refuses to raise the federal minimum wage, by the way. Okay. China has eradicated extreme poverty, it eradicated a few years ago. So there is a difference. I don't want to call it imperialism light, economic imperialism light versus um, versus the 19th century style militarist economic imperialism that the United States is pursuing. But it is imperialism. China is imperialist by its very nature, the very nature of the economy, global economic integration under its control. Now, it does not coerce countries. It does not go to Ukraine and say, you have to hand us over half the receipts from your mineral wealth, including rare earth elements, most of which, I don't know, they're not reachable. A lot of that is in territories that the Russians have already captured. I don't know, in the eastern part. I don't know how the Ukraine is in a position to hand those over. But the hand us oil, gas, raw materials, those receipts are ours. Infrastructure development contracts, which may range from 3, 4, 500 billion to over $500 billion, putting restrictions on which countries get the infrastructure contracts that Ukraine is going to dish out after this war is over, making sure China doesn't get those. Okay, that's economic imperialism, by the way. And then even U.S. politicians, elected officials, demanding, if this is not imperial, Europeans, mainstream European politicians, have come out and said, if this is not an example of imperialism, we don't know what is. Demanding that Zelensky, is corrupt and decadent and inane as he is in pursuing a forever war doctrine that the neocons sold him during the Biden administration, arguing just yesterday that that this war will just keep on going. We don't see an end to this war. This forever war doctrine, he's actually bought this. As inane as he is, you cannot have politicians from the United States demanding his ousting. In other words, a regime change operation through the power of suggestion, because the U.S. is in a position to say, look, we're not going to sign that. And by the way, they have backed out of this. We're not going to sign that deal to provide protection for you in exchange for those minerals. It's not just minerals, by the way. They wanted an infrastructure development. They want control of the ports. They have a lot of demands in that deal that never went anywhere because Trump, on February 28th, sat down with Zelensky and J.D. Vance, and the whole thing exploded into an uncivilized argument about what constitutes diplomacy and how grateful or ungrateful Zelensky is to King Trump, to President Trump. In any event, the issue is not about Trump. It's not about Zelensky. This is an inter-imperialist rivalry. Russia is interested in securing a zone of influence because it claims its national security is at stake. The U.S. is interested in economic imperialism, those minerals, the contracts. It wants to enrich its companies, okay? And then isolate Europe. It wants to reduce, it's very clear, 10 days before Trump met with Zelensky in the White House, on the 18th of February, in other words. He sent Marco Rubio and representatives of his administration in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to meet with Lavrov and a Russian delegation. Europeans were excluded. Europeans were outraged because the writing has been on the wall from Biden to Trump. It's not just Trump, by the way. I want to make sure that everyone understands this. This is American imperialism is bipartisan. It's just that the modalities and the style of American imperialism vary because Trump is much more, as a businessman, coming from a very different perspective, is much more interested in economic imperialism minus the high costs of military Keynesianism, that is, borrowing to pour money into defense and to military operations that go nowhere, and then the taxpayer is left hanging with the bill of increasing the cost of interest every year on the budget to pay for the public debt, because the US public debt is rising. So Trump is an economic imperialist. There's no doubt about this. But Biden was a Cold War liberal who bought into the forever war doctrine and did not pursue, and Trump is absolutely right, he did not pursue diplomacy as a means to end this conflict. And the US pursued this conflict, encouraged conflict with Russia so that it can break European dependence on Russian energy, gas and oil, sabotage the Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 2 pipeline, providing natural gas to Northwest Europe, especially Germany. So the U.S. made no mistake, made no apologies. I should say mistake. It made no apologies about the fact that it wanted more integration of European countries with the U.S., although the U.S. is charging them more for natural gas, for example, okay, and less dependence on Russia, which increasingly, of course, that only sent Russia closer to China. As a result of what the U.S. did here, it undercut European economic interests in this inter-imperialist rivalry, okay? It reduced it more to where it was during the early Cold War as a junior partner of the United States. This is why the Jacques Delors Institute was so outraged about American imperialism, because Jacques Delors, of course, strongly believed in Europe, the European Union, rising to, that old Charles de Gaulle view that the European Union, that Europe should stand up to the United States, that the sovereignty of Europe is important. Each European country, especially the greater, especially France, Germany, the UK, should stand up to their senior partner across the Atlantic. Now, because they went along with Biden, and now on this war in Ukraine, as well as the disaster in the Middle East, that genocidal campaign in Gaza, they went along with all that because their corporations' interests converge with those of corporate interests in the United States. That was imperialism, by the way. That's how imperialism works. Corporate interest benefit. Certainly not the workers. We have had the last 5 years enormous inflation because of all this. And now with tariffs, it's about to go even higher. Inflation has not eased. It continues, by the way. So the European economy is squeezed by American imperialism, continued steadiness of China. China has nothing to worry about. IMF, World Bank predict steady growth around 5% for China, half of that for the United States, by the way. Europe underperforming within the G7. So this is very important because the Europeans, fashioning themselves as equals to the United States, now find out with the Ukraine conflict coming to an end, because Trump wants it over, and he's certainly going to back out of it, they find out that they're sidelined. And on top of that, there are sanctions against them, which I remind you, Warren Buffett, not a Stalinist, not a Marxist, argues this is warfare. This is economic warfare. When you do this, you're declaring economic warfare on the other country, whether it's China or your European allies, Canada and Mexico, for example. hardly enemies of the United States, by the way. But yes, they are. If you follow the logic of imperialism, and Trump is correct, if you follow that logic, any country, Japan, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Taiwan, which the US needs to counterbalance China, to agitate in Taiwan, in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea, South Korea, they're all enemies. If you follow the logic of imperialism, why? Because the US is out for market share, global market share. And it's doing it in an aggressive manner. So the inter-imperialist rivalry is destabilizing the world economy, and the result is, as just recently, these statistics that have been published are very alarming. 24 people in a population of 8 billion owning as much wealth as the GDP of France. 16%. This is unbelievable. This is an enormous amounts of money. While we have rising socioeconomic inequality in most countries on the planet, China is an exception in the last 20, 30 years, where socioeconomic upward social mobility has been steadily continuing on that path. Steadiness in especially the Scandinavian countries, but in the core European and countries in the United States, Canada, Australia, what we have seen is rising socioeconomic inequality. Imperialism, in other words, has shown that it is to the detriment of the working class and to the benefit of the billionaire class. Or as one scholar recently, I was reading an article called The Super Billionaires, called it the super billionaires, these people with more than 50 billion in their pocket, I guess. So, and these people are influential. And what greater symbol of influence can you have than Elon Musk in the White House, running around with his casual attire in the Oval Office and speaking freely as though he's a co-president. And Elon Musk represents Silicon Valley. So the takeover, another very good article I read recently, the takeover of Silicon Valley of the federal government in Washington determines policy domestically and in the foreign affairs. So economic imperialism is really ultimately about one thing: capital concentration and capital accumulation, to the detriment of the rest of society. I'm going to end it there. I've gone over an hour. I want to thank you for listening. We're going to continue with more of this in future sessions. I want to invite you to please ask questions, write comments. By all means, I encourage you to do that. And I want to plead with you to join this channel. This is a channel that is managed by my very good friend, Asad Alim. And it's educational. The agenda here is to educate the public. And that's it, nothing more. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you.